Hi, everybody. It's Jennifer here with the CAN Network, Creative Aging Network in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I am going to be teaching you a short little tutorial on how to paint a watercolor landscape. So here's an example of the landscape that we're going to be painting. I'll hold it up closer to the camera so you can see. And we're going to be experimenting with some different techniques, some wet on wet and some lifting techniques. For this activity, you're going to need a piece of watercolor paper. This is a cold press paper, which means it has a texture to it. It's about 140-pound weight. We're going to be using a large flat brush and a smaller pointed brush. We're just using your basic tray pan of watercolors. This is not anything fancy or super expensive. These are praying watercolors. I have a water container with water and then some paper towels because we will definitely need those with our lifting. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is some wet on wet technique. So we're going to need to wet our paper. I'm going to be using the big flat brush. I use this for washes. And I'm going to be wetting the paper starting at about halfway down the paper. The secret with watercolor and being able to control the color is the water. So you want to take your time and apply the water for this technique only where you want the color. The color will follow the water. So I want to make sure that I have it all wet because if I don't, there will be white spots on here. And this is going to be our sky. So adding just a little bit more. Okay, I think I have all the water on there that I'm going to need. So now it's time to add some color. So I'm going to be starting with some blue, and I'm going to start up at the edges because it's typically darker closer to the edges. And I'm just going to add some touches of this color, move it around, and let the water move it around. As you can see, I'm not adding everywhere. I'm just leaving some white spots because we do want some clouds. And with watercolor, it's important to save the white of the paper for those things. So just adding, and if any place looks a little too dark to you, add some more water, and then you can use your paper towels and just lift, just like that. So we do some lifting techniques with the brush, but we also do lifting techniques with the paper towel. I like that because it creates a nice texture in the sky. And if you can see that, I'll hold it up a little closer here. You can see it does look like clouds. And the water works with the color and it just kind of bleeds and spreads around. It looks really interesting. So now I'm just going to add a little bit of red paint over here just to give a little bit of interest in my sky. Maybe a little bit right about here and across. Just makes it a little interesting. Adds a little other color in there. Mine's mixing with the blue, so I'm really getting more of a purple look, which is nice. Again, just lifting, dabbing slightly, going back in with a little bit more red. Now you see how dark that is? It doesn't have to stay that way. Add some water and let the paint just kind of, the paint and water just kind of do their thing. Just like that. And then again with the dabbing. One of the reasons why I'm doing the dabbing is because I don't really want to wait too long for this to dry, because it is helpful if you can allow time to dry in between, and of course that's kind of hard to do with a tutorial like this. So yeah, I like that. That looks good. Now the next thing I'm going to do is our tree line, and you want it to be rather wet for this first part. So I'm just going to mix some purple and some blue here on the side of my palette. And I'm going to come across, not all the way halfway, about right here, about little over a third of the way down. And I'm just going to come across like this. And then I'm just going to make some jagged edges. Pushing it up, the paint up, and then down as well from the middle of this section. Now this is my tree line, and what it's basically creating is a reflection all on its own because the paper's wet. So the way that it's bleeding down in here just is really, really interesting. I'm going to add a little bit more color in here. I want this to be fairly vibrant. And I'm just going to let it bleed, just kind of do its own thing right now. I'll go back into that later. Pushing some of the paint down with my brush. So it's there. Okay. I like it. So now I'm going to work on my water area. And so that would be the area from the tree line down. So I'm just going to add a little bit of blue, the wet brush, again my big brush, and I'm just going to move it around the paper, adding more water to it so as not to make it too dark, and just letting it move around. While I'm doing this, I'm keeping an eye on my tree line and what it's doing up here at the top. If it starts to get a little too crazy, that's what you have paper towels for. You can go back into that and really just kind of work with it. Because this paper was dry on the bottom, I have to add the water as I go with the color. And then I can take my brush with just the water and go back in. This is really kind of a lift technique too. It lifts the paint up and causes these nice little lines across. There. It looks nice. Okay. So I'm going to take my paper towel up in here to the top of my tree line and just dab just a little bit. There. Okay. That looks nice. So far, so good. I'll hold it up here so you can see. See? All right. So I'm going to take my paper towel and I am going to dab at the bottom just like this, because this is where our foliage is going to go. And I don't want it to be too wet when I put it on there. So I'm just dabbing that. And the point is just to dry it off just a little bit. And then I'm going to mix up a dark color. I'm going to mix some blue and purple there with a little bit of brown there. This is where the foliage is going to go. And I want this part to be kind of dark. You want to keep your edges pretty rough. This is the water line and right here, and we don't want it to be, you know, too nice and neat. This is going to have the appearance of being kind of rough, a little overgrown. So there, a little more blue and brown in that color. There we go. Okay. I like that. But again, I'm going to use my paper towel and do some lifting because I want some texture in here. And that creates texture. So where we have that texture in the lighter spots, I'm going to take a little bit of green and just add some touches. Now, the water and the paint will kind of take care of the rest. But it just adds a little bit of depth, a little bit of dimension of color in here. And I'm not painting it solid, I'm just adding some brush strokes here and there of the color. think I might add a little bit of brown in here too. Not too much. Just spread it around. This wet on wet technique just really allows the paint to do a lot of the work for you. You just add some touches of color and the paint does the rest. Okay. So we're just going to let that sit for a minute and kind of do its own thing. We're going to go back up here and work on our tree line. So we're going to do some more lifting, but this time we're going to lift with a brush. So I'm using a wet brush, my smaller brush with the point, and I'm going to go back into the bottom half of this tree line and lift some of this paint up. I'm just wiping it off on the paper towel over here at the side as I do that. This kind of establishes a water line in here. Just like that. So you can kind of see where the tree line stops and the reflection starts. Just like that. Just by lifting it up, you create this effect with a wet brush in here. Just like that. I like it. I also like to take my bigger brush and just kind of, it's wet, there's no paint on it, and just flatten out the bristles. Hold it really close like this and just kind of spread it that way. It just kind of gives you the feel that the current, the water is moving. There, just like that. Now as this dries a little bit more, we'll go back into the top area here and add a little more detail so that we can have some stronger shadows and lines and of the tree, the edges of the tree. So yeah. So the next thing that we're going to do is work on some grasses down here at the bottom. Now, I don't want these grasses to be up close. I just want to do like a patch of a few grasses, and I want them to kind of be watery and run around because they're just not in the foreground. So I'm going to use some brown for this. I'm going to take some brown, and then I'm going to clean off my brush and add a little bit of yellow to it. Looks like I got a little bit of the purple in there too, but that's all right. I like that. And I'm going to start at the bottom using my pointy brush, using just the very tip of the brush. And you can see it's bleeding. That's okay. We want these to be kind of blurry in the background. Yeah. You can always, if your paper's a little wet, do some dabbing. Just kind of starting from the top up. And I like to kind of bend my grasses around. Just like this. Now, these are all going to be just along the water's edge. So I'm just working, just kind of pulling some of the paint up that's in there already. I'm not adding too much more. So that's really kind of just faded and blurred in the background, and that's okay. That's the way we want that. We'll do some more grasses up towards the top, the front, I'm sorry, when we are ready for that. And those will be, the paper will need to be mostly dry for that though. So we're just gonna have to wait a few more minutes. But I think we're ready to paint our tree line. So in order to do this, I am going to take some blue paint and some purple paint and mix it together. I like mixing these two because sometimes you can see the blue and sometimes you can see the purple, and it just gives your colors a little more interest, a little more depth. So I'm going to go back into these areas up here, and I'm going to paint only in the top parts. And I'm just making just a little more structure now that the paper's kind of dry in my trees. And you can have some of them be really tall, but you do want them to be a little jagged like that. Otherwise, they start to look like buildings. So I'm just using the very tip of my brush to just push this around, just like that. And you'll see where the paint's still kind of wet that it bleeds, but that's okay. We can lift that back out. So I'm just really kind of pushing at the top here. Only the dark part, because the rest of it is the reflection, and we want that to stay fuzzy. Just like that. And the actual shape of this is kind of a personal choice. Maybe you want your trees to be lower and not as tall. Or maybe you want them to be short and looks kind of like scrub pines or something that you might see along the shoreline. I do like to let mine kind of fade out down that way. Now I'm going to use my wet brush again and go back and just kind of lift out a couple of areas. The brush is wet, but it's not dripping. It's wet enough to lift out paint, but not wet enough to add any more water to the equation here. And we'll go back once the sky is dry and add some yellow washes, and you'll get the feeling that there's a sunset back behind this tree line. And that's why it's in silhouette and so dark. So where my paint has run down here, I'm going to use my brush again and just kind of lift some of that out and smear it with the brush. Just like that across. Just kind of flattening out my brush and lifting up some of that paint. And then I'm doing the same right there at that harsher edge so that it's not so harsh and it is a little fuzzy and the paint will kind of bleed. That makes a really nice reflection. Let's see, I'll hold that up a little closer so you can see. You can see where I went back and lifted some of the paint out and then softened the edge so that it looks like water. You can always go back and add a little more color if you feel like it needs to be darker in some places. Just kind of a personal choice. If you want to personalize it and make it something that you want. It says something about you. Okay, so I'm going to take my paper towel, which is now starting to look kind of colorful, and I'm going to dab at the bottom of this so that we have not too much extra water. So basically what I'm doing is lifting up the water at this point. And I think I might add just a little bit more green in some areas. I don't want this to be too faded because it is right up at the foreground. So this is color that you would see up close and personal here. I do like the way these grasses look in the background here, just kind of almost a light shadow. So I think it's time to put our more detailed grasses in. So that's one of the reasons why we lifted out the color here so that it looks a little bit not quite as wet. So that once it's not as wet, it will give us a little more control. Just a little more green, I think, some of these areas in here. So for these grasses that we're going to make right here in the front and in front of these will serve as the grasses behind. I'm going to take some green paint and I'm going to add a little bit of blue to it and a little bit of brown. Mixing paints is fun and you get these neat. So this is like a dark army green maybe. I'm going to roll my brush around in it so that there's a lot of paint on there. And I'm going to start at the bottom, about right here, and pull this up. Very light, using only the tip. And if it bleeds around on here, that's okay. It should be nice and dry up here where the water is. I'm barely touching the paper with my brush. And I like my grasses to just kind of bend over in the breeze and add some short little strokes right here in the edges, just like that. And I like to have them going both directions. Some lighter and some darker, with a very light touch. And it's okay to go over top of the shadowed ones back here in the background with the darker green. And you'll see that some of them will run and some of them will be very clear, depending on how wet your paper is. And that's okay, because it just makes some of them look fuzzy and in the background. And some of these are just maybe more clear because they're right up front. You can do as much of this as you like. I don't think it needs very much. You can also mix a little more brown in there, darken up some of them a little more. They're probably not all the same color. And having different colors just makes it look more realistic and gives you a little bit more depth. A little more brown in there. There. I like it. Just have them going in different directions, just like that. Okay. And then you can add just some darker patches, make it look a little rough in some places. Be a little more green in that brown, just like that. Really kind of gives you a perspective. This is your foreground right here, where you see a little more detail, then your middle ground, and then your background. So we have two more things to do, and then I think we'll be able to call this one finished. I'm going to add a little bit of a yellow wash up here to the sky and then down here in the water, just to brighten this up a little bit, make it look like it's a really colorful sunrise or sunset. So I'm going to add a little bit of yellow, not a lot. And in order for this to work, your blue paint really needs to be dry, because if it's not, you're going to get green for your sky. So I'm just adding in some of the white areas here the yellow paint, and then just watering it down and pulling it across. Close to the tree, you really want to be careful not to touch the tree line, because it's not dry yet. And if you touch it, that's going to give it permission to run all over the place. So I'm just adding some yellow in places. Watering it down. Watercolor does tend to dry lighter once it dries. Now, because this is a reflection, we need to add some yellow down in here too. Again, I'm not touching the reflection. It's still a little too wet for that, but I am coming up right next to it and pulling some of this orange. Well, it's orange because it's on top of the red, but it's yellow paint. Pulling some of this down in there. So we have a pretty yellow reflection in our water. So we have one more thing that we're going to do, and this is just a nice little effect that I like to do in a lot of my paintings in the foreground. And it doesn't take much, but I am going to use a very wet brush, my smaller, pointier one, and I'm going to roll it around in the brown paint right here and get some brown paint on there, maybe a little bit more brown and some yellow, because I don't want this to be too dark, but we're going to do some splatters or just some flecks of paint. And this is just kind of a nice technique. It maybe gives you the effect that maybe there's some fireflies or things blowing around in the breeze. I'm going to push my painting away from me so that it's not too up close and I end up getting the paint all over the back and the sky, because I just really want it up front. So I'm going to point my finger, just like my pointer finger, just right here, And I'm going to take my brush and lay it over top of my finger and just tap it very lightly. This is also nice to do maybe with, if you want white, just do with some white gouache. Now, keep your paper towels handy, so if it gets anywhere you don't want it, you just dab it up immediately and it's not a problem. Maybe try that again with some others. Just across. And like I said, paper towels, keep that from turning into any kind of an issue. And there you go. I do like the splatters if you can see them on there. Just kind of nice little effect right there in the front. I like it. I think it's finished. So there we go. That's a couple of techniques with watercolor. Wet on wet technique, some lifting techniques, and a splatter technique. So I hope you had fun, and thanks for joining me.